The gruel was still warm when Susan Gunnell lifted the spoon. She had made it herself, oatmeal thinned with water, a little butter worked in at the edge of the pot, the way Mr. Blandy liked it when his stomach was bad and everything else sat wrong. She had carried it up from the kitchen and set it on the parlor table, and when she looked down into the bowl before bringing it to her master, she saw something she had not put there. A fine white sediment had gathered at the bottom, the way flour settles when you do not stir fast enough, except that Susan had stirred this. She had stirred it twice. She dipped the spoon. She tasted. The burn was immediate, not the slow warmth of pepper or the spread of mustard, but something sharper, a chemical brightness on the back of the tongue, behind the teeth, catching in the throat in a way that had nothing to do with food. She set the spoon down on the edge of the bowl. She did not make a sound. When she looked up, Mary Blandy was standing in the doorway. What passed between them in that moment, whether Mary's expression changed, whether her hands moved, whether she stepped forward or back, the record does not specify. What is recorded is that Susan Gunnell removed the bowl, that she told her fellow servant Robert Harmon what she had found, and that she poured the gruel into a cup and set the cup aside. She did not throw it away. That detail matters. She was already thinking about what might need to be proved. It was the summer of 1751, in the town of Henley-on-Thames, and Francis Blandy was dying. Whether his daughter had poisoned him knowingly, or whether she had been deceived into doing it, was a question that would occupy an Oxford courtroom the following spring, preoccupy the reading public of England for years, and has never been answered to the satisfaction of everyone who has examined the evidence. What can be said with certainty is this: arsenic was in the gruel. Francis Blandy ate the gruel, and the man who sent the arsenic to Mary's door was already making arrangements to be somewhere else. You need to understand something about Henley-on-Thames in 1746 before any of what follows makes sense, and that is that a woman's entire future, her security, her respectability, the roof she would grow old under, all of it arrived, or didn't arrive, attached to a man's name. Mary Blandy knew this as well as she knew her own reflection. She was 27 years old by the time Cranston appeared, which was already, in the arithmetic of the era, cause for a certain private alarm. She was educated, she could read and write and converse with facility, and her father, the town clerk Francis Blandy, had seen to it that she had been given what polish the county could offer. She was not beautiful, or not what the period called beautiful. Witnesses described her as plain, with a long face and dark eyes that were said to be her best feature. What she possessed in abundance was intelligence, and what intelligence gave her, in a world that could not yet decide what to do with intelligent women, was mostly a heightened awareness of her own situation. Francis Blandy was a prosperous man, or appeared to be one, which in a market town amounts nearly to the same thing. He was the town clerk, a position of some dignity, and he moved through Henley with the confidence of a man accustomed to being consulted. The local consensus held that he was worth £10,000, a figure repeated often enough in tavern conversation that it came to have the solidity of fact. The actual state of his finances was rather different, but nobody knew that yet, and the rumor of £10,000 had a long reach. It reached Scotland. It reached the ears of Captain William Henry Cranston of the British Army, the fifth son of a Scottish peer, a man of excellent family connections and very limited funds, who arrived in Henley in the spring of 1746 on a regimental posting, and introduced himself at the Blandys' home on Hart Street. Cranston was 32. He was not much to look at. Contemporary accounts describe a slight pockmarked face and a manner that ran to charm in the absence of any particular distinction of person. What he had was conversation. He was attentive in the way that men sometimes are when they are calculating something, and what he was calculating, it seems reasonable to conclude, was the £10,000. He paid his visits. He stayed for dinner. He made himself agreeable to Francis Blandy, who enjoyed his company, and he made himself essential to Mary, who had been waiting a very long time for someone to want her. By the autumn of 1746 they were, in Mary's understanding, engaged. There was one complicating fact, which Cranstoun was aware of and Mary was not, which is that he was already married. Anne Murray of Jedburgh had been his wife since 1744. They had a child. The marriage was not disputed. It existed in the parish register. It had been solemnized before witnesses, and Anne Murray continued to live in Scotland, under the belief that she was a captain's wife. Cranstoun's position on this was that the marriage had been irregular and was therefore invalid, a claim he had put before the courts in Scotland, and which had not, as of 1746, been decided in his favor. It would eventually be decided firmly against him in 1748, in a ruling that confirmed what anyone not named Cranstoun had never doubted. The marriage was legal, the wife was real, and the child was legitimate. In the meantime, he said nothing to Mary or to Frances Blandy, and he continued his visits to Hart Street. The smell of the place has not survived the record, but you can reconstruct it from what the era offers. Coal smoke from the grates, the river damp that settled into Oxfordshire stone by November, the particular domestic warmth of good wool curtains and beeswax candles that marked a prosperous household. Henley in autumn is not an uncomfortable place. Mary sat by the fire and wrote letters to Cranstoun when the regiment was elsewhere, and Cranstoun wrote back in the way he had learned to write, with just enough tenderness to sustain what she needed to believe. When the Scottish court's ruling became impossible to conceal any longer, 1748, Cranstoun did not confess. He rewrote. The marriage, he told Mary and her father, was a legal misunderstanding, already being appealed, certain to be overturned. Anne Murray, he said, using a word that should have been its own verdict, was a designing woman. Frances Blandy was not persuaded. Frances Blandy, to his credit, and perhaps to his eventual cost, had never been persuaded. He had tolerated Cranstoun, and he had watched his daughter's attachment deepen, and by 1749 he had formed a firm opinion that the captain was a fortune hunter who would never receive his blessing, and that the sooner Mary accepted this, the better for everyone. He said so. He said so more than once in terms that became less diplomatic as the years passed, and the dinners at Hart Street became, by degrees, less frequent and less comfortable. What is recorded is that Mary continued to write to Cranstoun. What is also recorded is that Cranstoun, understanding that the father was the obstacle, and that the father showed no signs of removing himself from the situation voluntarily, began at some point in 1750 to send Mary something else along with his letters. He called it a love powder. He said a Scottish wise woman had prepared it. He said it was perfectly harmless, an old remedy, a charm almost, used in the Highlands to soften a hard heart, that if Mary could find a way to introduce it into her father's food or drink, the old man's resistance would ease, his affections would warm, his objections would melt, and he would consent at last to the marriage that was the only thing in the world standing between Mary Blandy and the life she had been promised. He said this in his letters. He said explicitly that she should not be afraid of the powder. He said it had no taste. Mary Blandy was 31 years old. She had been waiting 5 years. She put the powder in the tea. The first symptoms appeared in late June of 1751. Frances Blandy suffered what was described by those present as a violent disorder of the bowels, the period's euphemism for the particular misery of arsenic's early work on the gut, which produces vomiting, cramping, and a burning thirst that no amount of water relieves. The family physician, Dr. Anthony Addington, was called. He noted the symptoms, prescribed palliatives, and at this stage suspected nothing beyond the ordinary summer ailments of an elderly man. Francis rallied. He was given broths and rest, and the acute phase passed, and for a brief period in July he seemed recovered enough to sit in the garden and take the air. Mary attended to him throughout. She was, by all accounts, a devoted nurse during this period, and this fact was not lost on anyone observing the household, though what it proved, or what it failed to prove, was a question no one had yet thought to ask. Cranstoun's letters continued to arrive. More powder accompanied them. By late July, Francis was ill again, worse than before. The burning in his extremities had spread. He complained of tingling in his hands and feet, of pain so persistent it disturbed his sleep. He could not hold food. The whites of his eyes had taken on a cast that those who came to visit noted with the particular quiet alarm that people reserve for symptoms they cannot name. Dr. Addington came back, and this time he looked more carefully, and what he saw made him look again. It was Susan Gunnell who brought the matter into the open. She had been watching for weeks. She had watched Mary add powder from a paper packet to the water gruel. She had watched the same to the tea. She had not yet spoken directly to anyone outside the household because she was a servant in a house where Mary Blandy was the daughter, and the distance between those two positions was not a small one to cross. But she had saved things. The cup from the earlier tasting, sediment from a pan she had washed without quite washing. The document that became the prosecution's foundation was, in a sense, assembled by a woman scrubbing cookware. It was Harmon who told her she had to speak to someone. "You must go to the apothecary," he said, or words close to that. The court testimony paraphrases, "before the old man dies, and nobody can say what took him." She went to Norton, the apothecary. Norton took what she gave him, and what he found in it was white in color, heavy, and not soluble in the usual way. He sent word to Addington. Addington came to the house and had words with Francis Blandy, and had words, separately, with Mary, and what those conversations contained was not fully entered into the record, though one exchange was. "My dear," said Dr. Addington, looking at his patient in the chair by the window, the August light falling through the curtains, "do you know of anything that has been put into your food?" Francis Blandy was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have been a very charitable man." The doctor did not immediately understand what he meant. Neither do we, entirely, whether Francis was speaking of himself, his willingness to trust, or of someone else, whether the sentence was directed inward or outward. Whether he knew, at that moment, what the white powder was, is not something the record resolves. What is recorded is that he said it, and that he did not say anything more direct. Mary, meanwhile, had done something. When she understood that the servants were talking, the exact moment of her understanding is not fixed. Sometime in early August, she went to the fireplace in the kitchen passage and attempted to burn her papers. She threw letters, or what the servants believed to be letters, into the grate. Harmon pulled some of them out, or most of them. The remnants were singed but legible enough. They would be entered into evidence the following March. She also went to the river. There is a witness, a fisherman whose name the record gives without elaboration, who testified that he saw a woman on the bridge above the Thames throw a paper packet into the water below. He described the packet. He described the time. He could not swear to the identity of the woman, but the description matched what had been seen leaving the Blandy house at that hour, and the trajectory of the thing as it fell. A small white paper folded as letters from Scotland were sometimes folded was not lost on the jury. The water would have taken it. The current at Henley is steady in August. Whatever the packet contained went downstream, and what was gone could not be retrieved, and that was presumably the point. But the other packets, the ones Gunnell had saved, the sediment in the pan, the cup with the dried residue in its bottom, those did not go anywhere. Francis Blandy lived another 2 weeks after Addington's visit. He died on August 14th, 1751, and the day before he died, which is to say on August 13th, there occurred the exchange that is the still center of everything that followed, and which has never been satisfactorily explained. Mary came to his room. The room smelled of camphor, and the faint, sweet, sour smell of a body that is losing the fight to sustain itself, the smell of bedridden illness that belongs to no particular era, and announces itself the same way in every century. She knelt at the side of the bed, or was described as kneeling. Witness accounts of the precise physical arrangement differ. And she wept, and she said something to the effect that she had not meant to harm him, that she had been deceived, that the powder was given to her as a thing of no danger. Francis Blandy, who was 69 years old and dying, looked at his daughter. What he knew at that point, how fully he understood what had happened, what the white powder was, how long it had been in his food, is not established with certainty. Dr. Addington had spoken to him. The household servants had spoken to him. He was not a stupid man. He said, "I forgive thee, my dear, if thou should be guilty." 8 words, depending on how you count the contraction. Examine them carefully because they have been examined by everyone who has ever written about this case, and they do not resolve. If thou should be guilty, not if thou art guilty, not though thou be guilty, the conditional, the hypothetical, the grammatical form that keeps a door open. He was either expressing genuine uncertainty about whether she had acted knowingly, he forgave her for a crime he was not certain she had committed, or he was performing something more complicated, a mercy that contained, in its careful phrasing, the acknowledgment of what he suspected, and the choice to love her despite it. Or he was simply a dying man who did not wish to die in accusation of his child. The grammar of deathbed forgiveness is not the grammar of the courtroom, and it resists reduction. Mary did not speak after that. She sat with him until he lost consciousness. She was arrested the following day. She was not taken from the house immediately. There was a period of several days during which she was, in the language of the time, confined to the premises, effectively under a form of private arrest pending the formal proceedings. During this time she wrote letters. One of them went to Cranstoun, still in England, and the contents of that letter are not fully known, but what can be inferred from his subsequent movements is that they communicated urgency. Cranstoun left England for France within days of Francis Blandy's death. He did not attend the inquest. He did not write a statement in Mary's defense. He crossed the Channel and took lodgings in Boulogne, and when the English legal machinery reached out its arm in his direction, it found nothing to grasp. He would remain in France for the rest of his short and increasingly desperate life, but that comes later. Mary Blandy was moved to Oxford Castle in mid-September, where she was held through the autumn and winter, awaiting trial at the spring assizes. What she did in those months, how she occupied herself, what she thought, what she felt, is partly recoverable from her letters and from a memoir she published in her own defense, a document of uncertain reliability but considerable psychological interest. She maintained, in writing and in conversation, that she had not known the powder was arsenic. She maintained that she had believed Cranstoun completely. She maintained that she had loved her father and had acted from no motive but a wish to see her marriage established and her future secured. Whether she was believed depended very much, it turned out, on who was listening and what they needed her to be. The winter in Oxford Castle was cold in the way that English castle winters are cold. The stone holds the damp rather than the warmth, and no amount of fire in a grate makes the air feel dry. Mary had visitors. She received clergymen. She received local ladies who came, one suspects, partly out of genuine sympathy and partly out of the pull that a condemned gentlewoman exercises on the social imagination. She was described by everyone who saw her during this period as composed, as dignified, as remarkably clear-headed for a woman in her situation. Whether this composure was evidence of innocence or of something harder to name, the observers could not agree. The trial opened at the Oxford Assizes on the 3rd of March, 1752. It lasted, in its entirety, 1 day. The courtroom at the Divinity School in Oxford was not designed for the purpose it was serving that day, which was to manage the several hundred people who had traveled to see Mary Blandy tried. The room was pressed beyond its capacity. People stood in the passages. The press of bodies produced its own weather. a warmth thick with wool and breath, and the particular excitement of a public occasion that everyone knows will be remembered. Mary arrived in the morning and was noted by every account to have entered without visible distress, her posture upright, her dress appropriate to the gravity of the occasion without being theatrical. She wore black. Her dark eyes were calm. The charge was murder by poison. Her defense was, and had always been, singular in its structure. She was not guilty because she had not known. She had administered a substance, yes. She had put powder into food and drink, yes. She had done this repeatedly over a period of several months, yes to all of it. But she had done it in the sincere belief that what she was administering was a love charm, harmless and herbal, an old Highland preparation of no dangerous character, given to her by a man she trusted with her life and her future. She was a dupe. She was a victim. She was, in the language her counsel deployed with some force, as innocent of murder as any woman who has ever been deceived by a man she loved. The prosecution's response was methodical. Dr. Addington took the stand and gave testimony of a kind that had rarely been heard in an English courtroom before. Precise, chemical, systematic. He had conducted what we would now call a forensic analysis, though the word was not available to him. He had taken the substances gathered by Susan Gunnell and subjected them to tests that any competent chemist of the period could reproduce. He heated the powder on iron, and it produced a garlicky smell that no natural herb or spice produces. He dissolved it, and noted its weight and character. He observed its behavior in acid. What he found was arsenic trioxide, white arsenic, one of the most reliably lethal substances known to 18th century medicine, or to the criminals who read medical texts. He was asked by the prosecution how long it would take for arsenic administered in repeated small doses to kill an adult man. He gave an answer. He was asked whether the symptoms suffered by Francis Blandy were consistent with arsenic poisoning. He said they were not merely consistent, they were definitive. The court heard from Susan Gunnell. Her testimony was precise. She described what she had seen added to the gruel. She described the taste on her tongue. She described Mary's expression in the doorway, though she was careful not to characterize it beyond what she had observed. She was asked whether Miss Blandy had given any explanation for the powder. She said, Susan told the court, that it was a powder to make her father love Cranstoun. She was asked whether she had believed that. The record gives her answer as a pause, followed by the single word, no. The letters were read into evidence. Cranstoun's letters, singed at the edges from the failed burning, were produced and read to the court. In one of them, he referred to the powder as something that should be administered with care. In another, he advised Mary on quantities. There was language in the letters that Cranstoun's defenders, he had none, but the argument was made by Mary's counsel, could interpret as consistent with a love powder story. There was also language that was not so easily managed, instructions, adjustments, a tone of careful calibration entirely at odds with the notion of a harmless herbal charm whose effects were ambient and symbolic. Mary's counsel made the best case available to him, which was not a strong one, and he knew it, and the jury knew it, and the court knew it. He argued that a woman so educated, so refined, so clearly fond of her father, fond in ways that were attested by servants, by neighbors, by the ordinary evidence of a life lived at close quarters with a parent she had never left, could not have administered a substance she believed lethal to a man she loved. He argued that Cranstoun's deception was total. He argued with some emotional force that the true murderer was even now drinking French wine in Boulogne, comfortable in his cowardice, while the woman he had used bore the weight of everything he had put in her hands. The jury deliberated for 5 minutes. It may have been a few minutes longer. The accounts differ by a minute or two, and the precise timing of 18th century jury deliberations was not recorded with the care we would now bring to such things. What is certain is that it was not long. They did not find it difficult. The verdict was guilty. The sentence was death by hanging to be carried out at Oxford Castle on the 6th of April, 1752. Mary had 34 days. What she did with them has been documented more fully than most things in her life. She met with clergymen. She wrote. She received visitors and conducted herself with a composure that generated considerable commentary among those who came to see her and went away uncertain what they had seen. An innocent woman's equanimity, some said. The nerve of a guilty one, said others. These interpretations told the observers more about themselves than about Mary Blandy, but the observers were not always in a position to know that. She prepared a statement. She maintained her claim of innocence, not of the act, which she had never denied, but of the knowledge. She maintained that she had been deceived. She maintained this in the statement, and she maintained it when speaking privately with the clergyman, and she maintained it on the morning of April 6th, when she walked out of Oxford Castle and toward the place where the gallows had been erected, and the crowd that had gathered to watch her die was, by accounts, very large. She wore black. She had asked in the days preceding about the height of the gallows. She had been told, and she had made one request, the request for which she is now almost exclusively remembered, the request that has attached itself to her name in the way that a single sentence sometimes does when it contains everything a person is and was and feared. "Gentlemen," she said when they came to prepare her, "do not hang me high, for the sake of decency." She was thinking to the last about how she appeared to others. Whether this is the thinking of a woman whose whole life had taught her that appearance was the only weapon available to her, or whether it is the vanity of someone who believed she had nothing worse to answer for than the spectacle of her own death, is not a question the record answers. She had been thinking about how she appeared to others since the age at which she understood what a plain-faced, intelligent woman with a father reputed to be worth £10,000 was worth on the marriage market of Henley-on-Thames. She had been thinking about it when Cranstoun arrived, and when he flattered her, and when his letters came with their small paper packets of white powder and their careful instructions. She was hanged at noon. She died, according to witnesses, quickly. The rope was positioned correctly and the drop sufficient, and she did not suffer long. This was considered merciful. Whether mercy was what she had earned or what she had been denied depended on which theory of her guilt you held, and the crowd held both. Cranstoun remained in France. He spent the months following Mary's execution in a state of progressive dissolution that has the quality from a distance of something almost literary, as if the structure of the story required him to decline by visible degrees. His family's assistance was limited. The British Army had no further use for him. His creditors were numerous and his means were not. He moved between lodgings in Boulogne and the towns near it with the restless economy of a man who is always one step ahead of a bill and one step behind a meal. He contracted what the record calls a violent illness. The nature of it is not specified, and the vagueness is itself a kind of accusation, given the era's tendency to associate certain disorders with certain lives. He died at Furnes, in what is now Belgium, on the 31st of January, 1752. Mary Blandy was still alive. She would not be executed for another 66 days. He died before her. Whether he knew what was about to happen to her, whether the letters found him, whether he understood what the trial's verdict meant, is not established. What is established is that he died in debt, in a foreign room, having escaped the English gallows at the cost of everything else. The exact circumstances of his death were not considered important enough by those who recorded them to be set down with any precision. He was 50 years old. He had a wife and a child in Scotland, whom he had spent 10 years calling nothing. His name appeared in the English press primarily in the context of Mary Blandy's execution, and the consensus in that press was that justice had arranged itself badly, that the man who had supplied the poison had died in his bed, such as it was, while the woman who had administered it had stood in public before a crowd and asked not to be hung high. Whether Mary had known is the question the trial put before the jury, and the jury answered in 5 minutes, and the question that the public has never answered to its own satisfaction in the 270 years since. The evidence against knowledge is a woman's love for her father, documented and credible, and the psychological possibility of a particular kind of willful belief, the belief that chooses not to examine too closely what it has been given, because examination would cost everything. The evidence in favor of knowledge is the instruction to stir the powder in, the repeated administrations over months, the burning of the letters, the packet thrown from the bridge, and Addington's testimony that arsenic does not taste of nothing. She told the clergyman who attended her in her final days that she was at peace. She said she had nothing on her conscience that she could not account for before God. Whether this was the truth or the most refined form of the lie she had been telling since at least August of 1751, she took with her into whatever comes after a noon hanging in Oxford in early April. The question is where the love powder ends and the poison begins. It is possible they were always the same thing. It is possible Mary Blandy knew this, and it is possible she did not, and the distance between those two possibilities is exactly the distance Cranstoun calculated when he sat down to write his letters, and it may be that he calculated it well enough to kill Francis Blandy and escape the rope himself, and that the only mistake he made was in not understanding that Mary would bear the weight of both their names while he crossed the Channel and declined, in a foreign room, at no one's particular expense. The title she has kept, in the records and the court transcripts and the pamphlets that sold very well in the spring of 1752, is murderess. The title she claimed for herself was victim. Francis Blandy, who forgave her if she was guilty, and said so in a conditional that the grammar of English has never quite resolved, is buried in Henley, and the stone over him does not speculate. She asked not to be hung high. They accommodated her. The crowd went home.